Canada's history has been comprised of strained relations between the disparate nations within her borders. Chief among these strained relations are between Canada's Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. For our country to continue to progress, we must ask ourselves, how can we help make the Canadian government better prioritize the status, identity, and issues of Aboriginal people? On August 18, 2010, a 20-year-old woman went missing. Her remains were found on September 1, 2012. Amber Alyssa Tuckrow disappeared on her way to Edmonton. After a brief attempt to get public help using a message between Amber and an unknown male, Amber's name was removed from the missing persons list, even though there was no evidence that she was not a missing person. Why was Amber's case not taken seriously? Why is the name of the young woman who was murdered forgotten? Her case is shockingly similar to those of so many other missing and murdered Aboriginal women across Canada, whose cases remain unsolved. In 2015, the United Nations called for a national inquiry into the alarming statistics surrounding missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Prime Minister Stephen Harper rebuffed the requests, stating, "I think we should not view this as a sociological phenomenon. We should view it as crime." When asked further, Harper stated the issue isn't really high on our radar, to be honest. Aside from the Conservative government, every other political party has called for an inquiry into this issue. Most people would be surprised to hear these facts, and yet they are the reality of the situation we are currently facing in Canada. CBC alone has confirmed 244 unsolved cases of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in Canada. There have been more than 1,000 cases reported between 1980 and 2012. The status and identity of these missing women play a large role on the lack of action on behalf of the government. In becoming more informed, it will be easier to put pressure on the Canadian government to renew the importance placed on Aboriginal issues. An example of this effort to create public awareness is the Red Dress Project. Red dresses are hung in public places to represent each missing or murdered Aboriginal woman. The project addresses the issue and displays it in a way that will trigger emotions from those who witness it. Aboriginal women are faced with rates of violence that triple non-Aboriginal women. The rate of family and community violence is even higher. So what can we as Canadian citizens do to help this issue? As a starting point, Aboriginal relations throughout Canada's history need to be discussed in the classroom. It is important for Canadian citizens to understand the historical implications faced by Aboriginal people, the greatest example being residential schools.
When the First Nations entered into their treaties with the Canadian government, such as the Blackfoot Confederacy in Treaty 7, they did so under the assumption that they were agreeing to peace treaties and a sharing of the land. Yet the Canadian government saw these treaties more as trade deals establishing their ownership of the land. Since this early misconception, dealings over the treaties have been strained and resulted in mutual frustration and anger. Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada is the federal department responsible for treaty disputes put forward by Aboriginal peoples. Additionally, the Indian Claims Commission can be used for an independent review if Aboriginal Affairs declines the validity of a claim. However, this does not mean that claims from Aboriginal groups are regarded with importance by the Canadian government. Claims often take decades for a resolution to be introduced. For example, in 1942, the Canadian government took a swath of land later called Camp Ipperwash from the Chippewa to build an army camp for the war effort. Originally, the government offered to purchase the land, but when the Chippewa decided to reject that offer, the government used the War Measures Act to force the deal on them. The Canadian Armed Forces continued to use Camp Ipperwash until 1995 despite calls for the government to hold to their promise and return the land. Yet still the land was not returned, which resulted in an occupation protest by First Nations people, which ended in the death of an Ojibwe protester. Finally, this year, the Canadian government is supposed to finalize a deal to return the land to the Chippewa 70 years after the promised return. The most popular headline regarding the return of Camp Ipperwash has focused on the accidental self-immolation of Pierre George, brother of the Ojibwe protester who was killed in the protest of 1995. The news media has presented this issue in the light of sensationalism around the suffering of two related protesters rather than the outrage that should arise from the ridiculously long process. We as Canadians tend to consume these sensationalized news stories that have less to do with the issues at hand and more to do with reinforcing the existing stories non-Aboriginals have created for our Aboriginal neighbors. Instead, if we focused on our shared story, instead of an us versus them, we can pressure the Canadian government to regard the treaties and related claims with the respect and urgency they deserve.
We can help the Canadian government better prioritize issues of Aboriginal people by urging them to reconceptualize the stories that impact their relationship. According to Dwayne Donald, the government and Aboriginal peoples inhabit separate realities in the stories we tell about the relationship. Stories are ones of colonization and European perspectives instead of collaboration and interdependence. I will use the example of the housing crisis in Attawapiskat in Northern Ontario 2011 to explain how relationships are based on which story we tell about their relationships. the living conditions in Attawapiskat had become so grave that the UN declared it a human rights issue, and the Red Cross had to give aid to those living in tents in bitter winter weather. Prime Minister Stephen Harper blamed the Attawapiskat for financial mismanagement, stating the government had spent some $90 million just on Attawapiskat, and that he obviously was not very happy with the results. In this story, Aboriginal peoples are inconvenient within the dominant non-Aboriginal narrative. The Attawapiskat have disappointed their paternalistic authority. The problem here is the story that forms how we understand this issue. A different story explains how the Attawapiskat signed Treaty 9 in 1885 in order to, according to them, preserve their long-established lifestyle. They believed that they would be taking part in collaborative compromising efforts between themselves and the Canadian government. The Attawapiskat story acknowledges tremendous government benefits from Treaty 9. Attawapiskat handouts are actually financial exchanges from legislative agreements. They are not to blame when, in actuality, they were given enough funds for 8 new homes. The government is trying to coerce the Attawapiskat peoples to leave their traditional lands if they do not enjoy the harsh living conditions. We recommend desegregating the Canadian government and Aboriginal peoples' histories and acknowledging that they inhabit the same reality and stories. This starts with the government acknowledging how their own aims and histories shape their relationships. Attawapiskat voices must be inherent in a collaborative effort rather than drowned out in a colonial tale.
As we have demonstrated, the status and identity of Aboriginal peoples in Canada is neglected by the Canadian government. We as citizens must pressure our government to regard this with more sincerity, and to do so, we must recognize that our stories are not independent from one another, but intertwined in a shared history.